Hello guys and girls, and welcome to the Summarizing Self-Assessment. So far today you should have already read the Henry Ford's Assembly Line article. You should have attempted to find the who, what, when, where, why, and how of that article, and you should have also tried to write your own summary. If you have not done that yet, then you need to go back and do that first before you watch this video. Now, just to recap a little bit, so far in this unit we have talked about the 5 rules of summarizing. We've talked about what needs to go in a summary, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We've practiced finding the who, what, when, where, why, and how. But today I had you all actually write your first summary. And since this is the first summary that you guys have written, what I wanted to do was make a quick video so that you can self-assess, that means self-check, and see how you did. As we go through this passage, you all are going to notice that there are different color fonts used throughout the passage. And that's because I used different colors of fonts to highlight the different questions. So the who is going to be one color, the what's going to be a different color, and so on. So let's get started. Here at the beginning, just with the title, we already have some important information. Henry Ford's Assembly Line. You're going to see that Henry Ford's is written in blue because that helps to answer the question of who this passage was about. It's about Henry Ford. Assembly line is written in pink because that tells us what this passage is about. It's about the assembly line. Moving on here to the first paragraph, Henry Ford again is written in blue because that's who the passage is about. And it tells us that Henry Ford changed the world. Not by making the first car, he didn't do that. Although he did make the first car that average people could afford. You're going to notice that part of that sentence is written in green. And that part represents why. It answers the question why. Whenever I'm trying to figure out the why of a passage, I ask myself, why does it matter? Why did somebody take the time to write about this topic? And it tells us there that he made the first car that average people could afford. And that's pretty important because most of us are average. So without him, maybe we couldn't afford cars. He helped more drivers get behind the wheel than any other person in history. That adds to what we just highlighted. But even more important, here's more of the what. Ford invented a production method that changed how work was done in factories worldwide. And we know from the title that that production method was the assembly line. Worldwide is written in red because that's where this is happening. His revolutionary ideas brought many manufactured goods within the reach of the masses. If we move on to the next paragraph, you're going to notice there's not as much highlighted here. From the time he was a teen, Ford was fascinated by the horseless carriages he had read about. He was a mechanical genius, and in 1891 he decided to build his own gas engine. He accomplished that goal in 2 years. 3 years later, he built a car that used the engine. Ford and 2 partners started Ford Motor Company and began manufacturing cars in 1903. Each vehicle was assembled by one worker and cost $1,000. At the time, only the wealthy could have one. Every one was painted black because that color paint dried fastest. In 1908, Ford began selling his Model T for $850. So I want you guys to notice something here. At first, when cars were made, they cost $1,000. And then after Ford created the Model T, the price went down to $850. That might not sound like very much money, but remember we're talking about the early 1900s, which was over 100 years ago. So $1,000 was worth a lot more then. That price was still too high for most people. However, he sold over 10,000 in the first year. The company could not keep up with the demand. Ford wondered how he could speed up the production of a car. It took each Ford worker about 12.5 hours to build a single car. So in the beginning, when he first started making the cars, before he came up with the assembly line, just one person made a car completely by themselves, and it took 12.5 hours. But Ford knew he wanted to make it faster. Now, if you look at the things that are highlighted here, we have 1891, 1903, and 1908. Those are all dates, so this is going to help us answer when this took place. Now this passage is kind of tricky because we do have several dates here. So what we can do, we can look at the dates and we can see that they are all around the early 1900s. So when we write our summary, instead of giving each specific date, we're just going to summarize it by saying that it happened in the early 1900s. Let's move on and see what we find out from the next paragraph. Then Ford had a brilliant idea. He invented the assembly line. There in pink, that is what he did again. Now what we're about to read in blue is how he invented the assembly line. With it, workers did one specific task, then passed the item on to another worker who would do something else. Gradually, a larger item, which is an engine, was built. Inside the Ford factory, men stood beside a conveyor belt. This continuous moving belt transported the items from one place to another. As each engine moved past, one worker placed a bolt. A person standing opposite him did the same on that side of the engine. Then the engine passed to other workers who tightened the bolts. Within 1 year, the system cut the time it took to create one car to 90 minutes. Remember earlier it took 12.5 hours, and now with the assembly line it took only 90 minutes. Ford passed on to his customers the cost saving from using the assembly line. So cars were very expensive, and part of the reason they were so expensive is because it was very time consuming to make one. He cut the time way down, which made cars cheaper to buy, so then more people could afford to purchase them. Most of his employees hated the assembly line. They found it boring. In fact, half of all workers quit each year. Yet Ford knew that the only practical way to make affordable cars, remember we want everyone to be able to have a car, was with the assembly line. So in 1914, there's another date, but we're still in the early 1900s, he decided to give his workers an incentive to stay. He reduced their workday by 1 hour and doubled their pay. Since most businesses made their workers toil long hours for low pay, people rushed to work in his factories. The assembly line didn't just revolutionize the car industry. Factories everywhere picked up the system, and the era of mass production had begun. Okay, so if we take all that information and we put it together into a graphic organizer, here's what we have. Who the article was about was Henry Ford. What Henry Ford did was he invented the assembly line. When he invented the assembly line was in the early 1900s. Where? Worldwide. Why does it matter? Why are people still talking about it? Because the assembly line made cars more affordable and helped begin the era of mass production. And then how he created the assembly line? Workers stand beside a conveyor belt and do just one task at a time. When they are finished, the belt moves the item to the next worker who does a different task. Eventually, a larger item, such as an engine, is built by everyone working together. What I would encourage you all to do, today I gave you this graphic organizer, but in the future, if I ever ask you to write out a summary, write these questions out on a piece of paper, and as you're reading the article, fill them in. That way, when you're trying to write your summary, you don't have to go back to the article and search for them. Now I'm going to show you how I would put this information together into a summary. Remember, when you summarize, there's no specific order that these have to go in. You don't have to put the who first and then the what. As long as you have all the information together, then you are good to go. So here's how I put it together. I started with when it happened, in the early 1900s. Then I tell who it was about, Henry Ford, and then I tell what he did, invented a production method known as the assembly line. Now, the next thing I have is how he did it. In Ford's assembly line, workers stood beside a conveyor belt and did just one task at a time. When they were finished with their task, the belt would move the item to the next worker who did a different task until eventually a larger item was built. Now I have why it matters, why it's important. The assembly line was important because it made cars more affordable for average people and helped begin the era of mass production. And then I end with where, which is worldwide. So as you guys can see here, I did not copy anything word for word from the text. I put it all in my own words. I kept it short. I only have a few sentences here. And I have all the important information, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Now I would like to know, how did your summary compare to my summary? Did you have all of the correct information? Let me know in the next question.